Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Amy Landau. I'm Director of Education and Interpretation for the Fowler Museum at UCLA. So thank you for joining us today or tonight, depending on where it is you're tuning in from around the world. The Fowler is pleased to present today's curator talk, Audrey Lopez and John Connelly, who are co-curators, who will discuss the curatorial process behind the current exhibition, Sangre de Nopal, Tanya Aguiñiga and Porfirio Gutiérrez in Conversation. This exhibition is on at the Fowler until January 12th, so please come see it if you haven't already. It's an honor to introduce both Audrey and John. Dr. Audrey N. Lopez is a curator and scholar who works at the intersections of public art, social practice, and spatial and racial justice. Lopez lives in Providence, Rhode Island, and works as director and curator of public art for the Greenway in downtown Boston. John Connelly is a curator and consultant who is based in Santa Barbara, California. He was previously director of the Atkinson Gallery at Santa Barbara City College. And prior to moving to California, he was director of the Felix Gonzalez-Torres Foundation in New York City. He co-founded the New Art Dealers Alliance and High Desert Test Sites, which is the experimental exhibition platform based in Joshua Tree. Now for a bit of housekeeping. If you have any questions during the program, we really encourage you to ask. Please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You could submit and upvote entries that you would like to be considered to be answered at the end of the program. So that's for our introductions. And now we're going to hear from Audrey and John. And we thought we would begin. It's a beautiful exhibition, so congratulations to you both. We appreciate your hard work on the exhibition. But I was wondering if you could first start off telling us a bit about the origins of the project and your research.
Sure, I'm gonna share my screen. We don't have any, there's so many images to share today, so please bear with me. We're gonna share a bunch of kind of behind the scenes images from how the show started. I just wanna make sure I'm sharing the right window with y'all. Um, can you see my screen? Is it a
That
full?
looks that looks great. It's full
Okay.
view.
Awesome. Well, wonderful. Thank you so much, Amy, for that introduction. We're really excited to be with you here. I'm Audrey Lopez, and my co-curator, John Connelly, is with us too. And we're going to kind of talk through a little bit in conversation with each other and then also with Amy, how the show got started, the kind of project origins, how it developed throughout the research phase of the Getty PST grant, because I think we ended up in a place that was really different from where we started out. So we'd love to share a little bit about that and what we learned along the way. And then ultimately also how this shaped the exhibitions, both here at UCLA Fowler Museum and then also at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santa Barbara. And really kind of how John and I have seen this project shape Tanya and Porfirio's practices, both collaboratively and then also independently as artists. So thank you so much for spending time with us today. And so Tanya Aguiñiga is a Mexican American contemporary craftsperson, fiber artist, born in Tijuana and worked across the border in San Diego and Tijuana, now based in Los Angeles. I'm sure many of you know her work, but she's done a lot of interventions, social practice work along the border, ambos, different performance pieces. So I won't go too deeply into it and happy to discuss more as we go, but I just wanted to broadly introduce the artist in case any of you haven't gotten to see the show. And then Porfirio Gutierrez is a multi-general textile Zapotec American artist based in Ventura, California. Also has a studio in Teotitlan del Valle in Oaxaca, Mexico, and works with natural materials, plants, insect, dye materials, as he is a weaver and fiber artist as well. And so really the show itself has come out of a conversation between these two artists that began all the way back in 2016 and 2017. So I was originally working at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santa Barbara on an exhibition with Tanya Aguiñiga. And part of the project that we were developing there, Tanya really wanted to touch upon migration, different natural materials coming out of the agricultural fields in Southern California, connecting with farm workers, specifically Oaxacan indigenous folks who have migrated to Southern California. She had known of Porfirio's weaving work and had connected with him previously, but it wasn't until we did a site visit at the Mixteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project in Oxnard, California, that we actually ran into Porfirio just by coincidence in that moment when we were going to talk to that organization. And really, that's where the spark of conversation began. Like, how could we collaborate on a project that incorporated natural dyeing processes, fiber art, and traditional weaving techniques, contemporary weaving, in ways that really connected with Indigenous, Oaxacan, and migrant youth, both in Los Angeles as well as in Oxnard and Ventura. So that's way back when we started thinking about the project. We weren't able to continue with it at that moment, but kind of kept the seed of the idea in the back of our head. And finally, in 2019, joined forces with John Connelly, Frederick Yanka, Dalia Garcia, and were able to respond to the Getty's PST proposal. So we put an application together and we're lucky enough to receive a research grant. And I think that research grant, John, if you want to jump in, but that was really kind of like a catalyst point for how those ideas and the project started to shift. And I'm happy to kind of talk through the residency and exchanges, but I wanted to pause and see if, John, there's anything you want to add in at that moment.
Well, yeah, the research grant came at a really interesting time. We started working on it, I think, February, March of 2020. Submitted the application, had all these, plans for what we wanted to do. Received notification that we were awarded the grant in June. And then, of course, that was in the middle of lockdown and COVID. So we really had to pivot and think about what our plans were and what we had put into the proposal. And I have to say that the Getty was so accommodating and so flexible and so supportive of all the organizations that were in this same predicament. But at the same time, I want to say that this opportunity to have the research grant for 2 years is just an extraordinary opportunity as a curator. And I think it made such a difference in all of our experiences. And it's just a really extraordinary opportunity to have those resources and have that time and have that flexibility. And it ended up, we did a number of different projects. We did gatherings, we did workshops, we had art labs, we had symposiums, we did travel to Oaxaca, and really learned so much. I think Audrey had a lot more knowledge of this subject going into the project than I did, but I really learned so much about natural dyes, about plants as medicine, about weaving techniques, textiles as text, and the cochineal, which I had really not known. I'd heard about it because I was an art history major, but it's huge impact on the culture, starting with its well, it was created in 500 BC by the Zapotec people, but it was discovered by the Spanish in the 1500s and imported into Europe and became one of the most wealthiest tools of that enterprise.
Thank you. And so really what kind of happened, I think, John, as you're saying, is throughout like the pandemic kind of conditions that we were in, this kind of core conversation that had started between Tanya and Porfirio, we ended up moving that around and having that in different places as we were able to, as that kind of research grant continued on. So this was everywhere from Tanya's studio in LA, that's pictured here, to Porfirio's studio in Ventura. As John said, different convenings in Santa Barbara and Santa Maria, youth workshops, which I have some images of, I'll share, and then really several trips to Teotitlán del Valle, which is Porfirio's hometown, and also Oaxaca City in Mexico. And so I think, And I also, just before we move on, I want to shout out to Javier Gutierrez, who was our videographer and documentarian. He did a lot of the photo documentation for this project. You'll see some of his gorgeous images as we continue on. If you see a bad image, it's probably mine or John's. The beautiful ones are all Javier's. So I want to quickly say thank you to Javier. But as we kind of continued following the threads of Tanya's and Porfirio's conversation, hold on, I'm sorry, I'm having trouble. There we go. Throughout these different places that we went to, we saw that, you know, several threads were continuing to come up, whether we were in Los Angeles or in Oaxaca City or in Oxnard. And so I'm about to show a slide with a bunch of text, but don't worry, we're going to go through some of these ideas as we continue our conversation today. But these were kind of some of the main threads of conversation that Tanya and Porfirio were sharing. You know, they both approach fiber art and textile and weaving from really different lenses. Tanya from a more kind of Western art and craft school approach, Porfirio from generations of knowledge passed down through his family in Oaxaca. Kind of contested definitions kept coming up of both authenticity, indigeneity, folklorismo, what can be defined as contemporary, both in the arts world, but also as craft, kind of competing definitions of arts and craft and wanting to push beyond those. Their conversation and kind of shared making in these spaces really became places that they were talking about processing the trauma of the border and that violence, experiences of forced migration or immigration, but also became places where I think John's going to speak to this much later, but ideas of play, like actually being able to, what does it mean to be free at the loom or be free in weaving? Like, what are those explorations of freedom look like? How can those be connected to ideas of rest and creative self-expression rather than, you know, having to produce something for a capitalist like tourism market? Obviously, this always included a lot of collaboration, not only with each other across Tanya's and Porfirio's practices, but also with ecologies and the natural world around us. So insects, cochinilla being one of the big collaborators in all of this work. And then really that awareness, like bringing visibility, like John said, like learning about the cochinilla, the history of it, as a metaphor that we can, or a lens that we can use to look at contemporary issues. So things like the history of colonization and exploitation of resources and materials, things like racialized and gendered labor. So all the cochinilla that produce dye are female, which we'll talk about in connection to Tanya's work. And then really thinking about how do these ecological and material and affective links, like emotional links, exist between these places, regardless of, or perhaps in spite of, you know, the violence of the border, of the US-Mexico border. And also, yeah, how do the artists think about sharing that with future generations of Indigenous youth, of immigrant youth, so that, you know, there are those connections made to their culture, but there's also allowed to innovate and be contemporary in those spaces. So those are some of the threads of dialogues that have been coming out of this kind of generative conversation between Tanya and Porfirio during this time. So this looked like, you know, a residency and exchange at Tanya's studio in Los Angeles, which included, you know, an exhibition, a BIPOC makers fair, a talk by Porfirio, hands-on demonstrations by Tanya and Porfirio together. You know, making side by side, there's this double floor loom, you know, Tanya sharing some of the more contemporary techniques that she's been working with, you know, inviting Porfirio into that, Porfirio inviting Tanya back into some of his own techniques and practices. But it also included exchanges with other contemporary fiber artists throughout Los Angeles. So, you know, there was a visit to Dougal Paulson's studio where the artists were able to experiment with 12 harness wire weaving. Leslie Nishigarawa, the double pickup on 8 harness looms with supplemental weave and floating warps. So really kind of being dropped into this world of contemporary digital craft, other ways of weaving beyond kind of, each other's practices, and really being able to talk with other artists and soak up all that information. This is images of Sarah Rosalina Brady with her computer-aided loom, which has 24 harnesses. So really thinking about kind of pushing the bounds of weaving in these contemporary directions, and being in conversation with contemporaries in the fiber art world in LA. And Tanya, added this slide to a different presentation we gave, but she always loves to note that, at the end of all these kind of exchanges, Porfirio got his own 8-harness loom, which was new for him and kind of brought a new dimension into his practice and work. John, do you want to share maybe a little bit about the youth workshops we did in Oaxaca? I'm sorry, in Oxnard and Ventura and Santa Maria? I have maybe 2 slides about these.
Yeah, so from the very beginning of our application, it was really important that we address issues of labor and also the undocumented youth and their families that work in the fields in and around the area of Ventura, which actually has the highest population of Oaxacan immigrants anywhere outside of Mexico. Which is another thing that I learned I didn't realize. So it was important for us to collaborate with the youth and to provide them with opportunities to see themselves as contemporary and as modern and as, but also part of their original culture. So we set up a series of workshops with them. We set up, we did an exhibition with them in Santa Maria, and our main liaison for this was Dalia Garcia. So she was the one that was working at MyCop when we started this project, and she was really instrumental in setting up all these projects.
Yeah, and I think, it was really interesting to see at Porfirio's studio, like this hands-on application of working with cochinilla, and how when you change the pH, you get a change in color and a change in hues. So working with, citrus fruits as well as more basic solutions, having youth actually get the chance to do hands-on, color changing with the cochinilla, to see it on the cactus paddles in Porfirio's studio, to see the range of colors that are possible to get from this. I think those were some of the conversations where even for me, it was like, oh yeah, this is like where, chemistry comes in a little bit, and these kind of, Western science, I guess, naming system can come help us understand this. And so Tanya and Porfirio led this series of workshops. Yeah, graciously, thank you, Porfirio, in his studio, but was a really wonderful hands-on time.
Yeah, and for me, this is really where I started to see that indigenous knowledge is science, and how overlooked that aspect is. So we learned a lot about chemistry, about pH, about how the different dyes react according to when they're harvested. So it was a huge learning experience for all of us.
And then, with Tanya and Porfirio, we started a couple different research trips to Teotitlán del Valle and Oaxaca City. There's going to be a lot of images here. Some are just for kind of landscape and context of the land itself. Our co-curator Freddie and Dalia and Porfirio and Tanya and John and I have been talking a lot about the continuity of land between these different spaces, on geological levels and also metaphorical levels. But a lot of the images are just to kind of give a sense of context about where Porfirio is working, where he was harvesting materials from, and that connection to those biological materials. So this is the valley around the city where Porfirio is from. And Tanya, Porfirio and I did about a week-long residency there, where we were continuing to explore some of these themes and motifs. I was there more as a researcher, just kind of recording conversations, so I probably shouldn't even be in the images. But John, you had a lot of interesting learnings too, as you were in Oaxaca and Teotitlán del Valle. And you shared a bunch of images from, what you picked up and saw there. So I'd love to hear a little bit more from you before we go into Tanya and Porfirio.
Yeah, well, I'd never been to Oaxaca before, and I'd been to Mexico City and Tulum and that areas, but I'd never been to Oaxaca. So to actually be able to travel there to do research was so extraordinary. And I think one of the as incredible as Mitla is a site, um, we one of the most moving experiences I had there was this visit to this small church in Teotitlán, called the Church of the Precious Blood of Christ. And you can see how, if you look closely at the image on the right, the ruins of the Zapotec buildings that were there prior to the Spanish invasion were incorporated into the Catholic architecture. And you just had such a sense of history and um, and this moving sense of cultures clashing, and then cultures coming through, really persevering.
Yeah, that resistance still. Um, so kind of as we walked around and talked, different conversations were coming up. You can see exactly what John is saying here as well in the architecture in the image on the left-hand side. Um, but really thinking about this connection to land, seeing where the cacti grow, where the nopal grows, hearing how Porfirio and Javier, who also lives in Tiltitlan del Valle, experience kind of geography and the different city boundaries in that area. And also again, John, like the larger kind of context of contemporary art and how it's expressed in Oaxaca and Tiltitlan del Valle.
Yeah, and so these are just a few pictures I snapped on the trip of the incredible vibrant street culture of art that they have in Oaxaca. And the two on the right are by a collaborative artist team, Tlacolucos, who live in the city Tlacolucos. And you can see one of their murals on the right, a detail of one of the murals on the right, and then how the imagery and their practice has been adopted into sort of the capitalist society that exists now, because that's uh, a store that's selling jeans that they've asked and this collaborative team has done other projects in the PST um, scheme of things. They were in the last exhibition, and they are currently in part two of the Sangre de Nopal exhibition, which is at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Santa Barbara. And I think we'll see a little bit of one of their paintings from that show later.
Yeah, and so like mirrored with what happened in Los Angeles as Tanya and Porfirio were visiting all of the different artists kind of studio, we also did the same thing in Oaxaca and Tiltitlan del Valle by traveling to both contemporary artist studios, artists who were working with cochinilla, and then also contemporary craft artists as well. And contemporary, I mean, like their work is contemporary and they've been doing it for many, many years. So we got to stop by and see kind of some of these more traditional crafts practices, and have the continued conversations with Tanya and Porfirio. John, I'm curious about kind of like if you could describe a little bit more of the specific, like, I guess, craft artist studios that we did go see and how you kind of felt there in conversation with either Porfirio's work or Tanya's work.
Sure. Well, on the right are two images from Porfirio's family's compound, um, where we did a dyeing workshop with indigo, and you can see we all made scarves and sort of tied them off to create certain designs. And then there was an opportunity to actually weave on the looms that they use to produce those items. And so that tradition, it's a family tradition that Porfirio grew up with, and it has a long history, of course. But at some point, the culture in the area rejected the use of natural dyes and turned to synthetic dyes. And so there's a whole history of that going on in that area, and the sort of tourism coming in, and sort of corrupting the purity of the history of the weaving with natural dyes and materials. And Porfirio actually sort of got burnt out of that and left the country and rejected his background as a weaver, and went to America. And we'll see a little more about his journey in a video piece he did about the migration process. But after a while, he went back and sort of realized that this was, part of him, part of his DNA, part of his history. His mom is a healer, and started to embrace it all and bring back this technique of natural dyes. And he single-handedly is responsible for reintroducing natural dyes as a viable alternative to synthetics. On the right, on the left, I think I said, maybe I got my mixed up a little earlier. On the left is Danya de Viana, who is a candle maker, who's been doing this tradition of handmade candles for many, many, many years, passing the tradition on from her previous generations. She also has a whole family compound that we visited, and it's just fascinating to watch the process, where she uses a bowl and dips it into the melted wax and then cools it and then she makes these really refined, delicate floral patterns, floral candles. And she has also been sort of discovered by a lot of influencers in North America or in the States, and has been featured in Vogue and stuff. But it was just interesting to see the history of these crafts and how they've evolved in this time period.
So as we were kind of going around, we were starting to think about, this is the only time I've ever seen Porfirio Gutiérrez lying down, resting and smiling. We were really thinking about, how privileged it felt to have this time to actually sit and think about these things and actually have the freedom to explore and the freedom to play without a lot of pressure around the outcome or the product. I think, for Tanya and Porfirio, both, that felt, they've shared that felt really freeing. And I think, eventually shaped the exhibition. But in this particular moment, there was not a lot of pressure for like what would be produced or what would come out of this time together. And kind of, I think, sitting into that and trusting that a little bit was this gift that I don't think any of us really saw before, but actually happened in the process of being together there. We got to explore the pueblo, the village, and go to a bunch of different stores. Some of them were secondhand clothing stores, which is where Tanya ended up finding, a t-shirt that would form a later part of a piece in the exhibition that we'll show. But, I think even that act of walking around the city together, sharing in conversation, Porfirio was able to share his own personal experiences growing up there, but then also things that he was doing in preparation when he did migrate to the US and, experiences of that came out of Teotitlán del Valle or other shared experiences from folks in that area who have also migrated to the US. And so I think, again and again, I saw that action, like that walking together or that making side by side, really kind of facilitated or created an ease around sharing and talking about some of these, heavier experiences or that can be heavier, both for Tanya and Porfirio. And became this place where we went to the corner store and they were able to, buy materials that are familiar for them. I'll come back to that in a sec. Like a can of sardines or, a juice called Boing or a packet of Tang or a water jug. That is what many people buy when they make the journey across the border into the US. And how could those everyday objects that we were, finding in that moment, how could those also be incorporated into this moment of play, of freedom, of trying out new techniques, of seeing what would happen? And so these images were taken, we were hanging out at night in Porfirio's family studio. Tanya was sharing a couple of new weaving techniques with Porfirio. You can see in the background, actually, the t-shirt she picked up at the secondhand clothing store that became part of one of the works in the show. But again, simple things, but I think that act of just being able to try it out and to play without a lot of those expectations was really generative. And this is something that continued the following morning as well, as Tanya began to weave this t-shirt that ended up forming a piece of the exhibition. And Porfirio started cutting into and weaving on this plastic bottle of water that is exactly the kind that he said he used when, you know, he was migrating into the US. And so again, like, to record the conversations that happen here, to think about the topics that came up, you know, to be able to play, and even Porfirio's brother-in-law got in on the action, you know, weaving with plant material and being able to craft something new and unexpected, was all part of the process and ended up being, you know, I think this kind of major node for the exhibition, or this kind of, yeah, moment where things really started to congeal in a particular direction. So after we spent time in Porfirio's family studio, we actually went out to the land itself. And Porfirio and Tanya started to weave just kind of in and on the land next to each other. And that's where kind of those two keystone objects in the show, which I'll show in a moment, came to be. But again, for me, I think, you know, the conversation is also part of the art that was generated there. So this is Porfirio's piece, Las Cosas que Cargan la Gente, and, you know, that forms a large-scale image at the entrance to the show. And sorry, yes, I'm going to back up and go through all the images to show Tanya's final piece as well. This is called Kid Dangerous, which is actually, you know, a piece in the show, but it's titled after the brand of clothing. So this was, you know, a tiny child's t-shirt that Tanya found with this like patriotic USA logo on the front, that she then like intervened with and wove over, but you can still, you know, the tag is on it from Nordstrom Rack, and thinking about those kind of currencies of exchange and those economies, those secondhand economies coming from the US to Mexico, back to the US. And again, thinking about those links through time and space between these places. Thanks for being patient as I scroll through all the images again. John, was there anything like when you saw these images come back from Oaxaca, or you were like first in conversation with them, what did you have any thoughts, or like what was your kind of thinking as a curator in the show?
Well, I think a couple things. I think, you know, the playfulness of the pieces that you see in this image here, and them working on them in the studio, is really what gave them a lot of freedom to experiment and to exchange ideas. And I think this idea of one artist doing a residency in another artist's studio is a pretty radical concept. I mean, I'm sure it's been done before, but it's not something that you think of as very common when an artist chooses to do a residency. Usually they get their own studio and they're sort of cloistered, and they might be in like a compound with other artists, but it's like the working process is still like very like, you know, cloistered. So I think that was something that was very radical and struck me about this research phase of the project, and what came out of it and what kind of final objects. And I hope we have a picture of the collaborative piece that Tanya and Porfirio ended up working on together for the show at the Fowler, which I think is called Tu Prima es Cochinilla, which is
Tu
your
prima
cousin
la
is Cochinilla.
cochinilla. Yes. So it's this piece. So Tu prima la cochinilla, your cousin the cochinillo. Doesn't quite have the same rhyme or playfulness in English, but yeah, this piece.
And you can see that the rug in the background is a traditional Zapotec motifed rug that Porfirio had made, and Tanya chose to round off the corners, and then they wove these cochineal dyed fibers that have this sort of purple hue into the existing carpet, and it sort of has a animal-like feel to me. It's quite beautiful. It's sort of the centerpiece of the show in a lot of ways.
Yeah, and I think yeah, I think it does. It centers kind of their relationship with Cochinilla, which is a part of the show as well. And yeah, I wish there were more of these works, and I'm hoping there are more in the kind of, you know, ether with Tanya and Porfirio, because yeah, I loved seeing this work kind of at the center piece of the show in this central location. I know I scrolled through a lot of images before this, but there are a few that I'd love to kind of talk through and then also pass off to John to talk through. But one of the things that I shared at the beginning when we were talking is kind of this gendered labor that happens with the cochinilla. You know, all of the dye producing little insects are actually female. So like they're the ones that are producing this beautiful kind of carmine red dye that, you know, is used from everything from makeup to textile dyeing to now foods and you know, comes directly from the insect as they eat the nopal cactus. That interaction between the nopal and the insect is what creates that red dye. And so one of the things that Tanya has really kind of centered in her work recently with working with cochinilla is this idea of gendered labor, you know, cosas que sangran, thinking about things that bleed, you know, women bleed, but then also just more generally, like the idea of this, you know, invisible labor that women are doing, especially women of color within the US. This is a piece, both these pieces are in the show, but Somos Mujeres was produced. Tanya actually made specifically for this show, was commissioned for this exhibition. And so you have these kind of ceramic paddles made off of the nopal paddles themselves, and then you know, the Somos Mujeres, the actual writing is made from the dye from the insect, and then each of the letters, it's hard to see at this kind of distance in the image. Each of the letters is outlined with a little pin with a dried cochinilla on the end. So again, like thinking about that work that women do, that femmes do, that's kind of unseen and undervalued, and really cluing into that kind of gendered aspect of the cochinilla is something that I've been really excited to see Tanya working with and bringing into this more, this current work for this show and into the future. Also, this piece, I've been thinking a lot about collaboration. John, you said like radical collaborations, not only with each other, Tanya and Porfirio, but how they both collaborate with ecologies and the environment around them. You know, Porfirio is always collaborating with cochinilla and different plants in his environment and using them to create dyes. This piece, Somos una tela continua, you know, Tanya was collaborating with the LA River, which is in the backyard of her studio. So as it was kind of like bringing refuse down the river, and that refuse was getting caught on branches of trees that were like hanging over into the river, she was pulling some of those items and then beginning to weave with them to create this piece. And so like to think about the river as my collaborator was really something that I got excited about, and something that I think is important in her work that's also mirrored in Porfirio's and is a conversation that they're continuing to have. John, is there anything you want to add about this piece or any of the previous pieces before we continue?
Yeah, I would just add, I think isn't this a portrait, like a family portrait?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's not always fully obvious. But her family plays a big role in a lot of the work and being a mother and the materials that appear in a lot of her works come from the physicality of that relationship with family.
Yeah, and yeah, motherhood and being a mother, exactly. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Um, Finally, one of the kind of, you know, a more digital based piece that's small and maybe doesn't get a lot of attention as it's set up in the current show is a cochineal map, which Tanya, throughout her travels across the Southwest US and into Mexico, was actually kind of geolocating different areas where she was finding cochinilla on nopal cactuses. So, you know, this happens all throughout northern Mexico and into the Southwest United States. The actual species of cochinilla can change, but it's united, like it's a continuous kind of map both of the nopal and then the bug that eats from the nopal. And so you can also add places that you've seen cochinilla and cacti. I think, you know, one of the things that we've been talking about with the show is yeah, of not like, you know, exposing too much knowledge or too much that people can exploit it, but sharing just enough so that people are aware of it and kind of begin to see it in their own environments and contexts.
I would also add that we still don't know a lot about cochineal.
Mm,
And in fact, when we did a visit at part of the research phase to the botanical garden, we were looking in their research lab facilities, and they had, every single species of bee and every single species of butterfly or whatever, but they had no specimens of cochineal. And I think Porfirio found that really fascinating. And he's actually gone on to do some research with the garden, the Botanic Garden, and our colleague Matt Guillaume, to map the DNA of the cochineal. And the results that they got back were almost inconclusive. There was not, it didn't like really make sense. So the mystery of the cochineal and what it supplies and offers us is still being, withheld. So there's a lot more research to do there and a lot more awareness to be made. I think a lot of people don't realize that cochineal is the only non-carcinogen red dye that's still used today in many of our food products. Everything from, your frappe, your strawberry frappe at Starbucks to your lipstick.
Yeah. One of the things, and I think this is the last piece that I'll share of Tanya's before we transition into some of Porfirio's work in the show, was this rust print of a border wall ladder from Tanya that she created in 2024. And this was a piece, this is actually more than 30 feet long. If you actually, hung it from the ceiling, you would see how tall this actually is. But this is actually an imprint of a actual ladder that was used by somebody to hop over the border wall between the US and Mexico. But one of the kind of one of the changes that the Trump administration made when Trump was first in office in his first term was the actual height of the border wall between the US and Mexico. So before, where it used to be 6 feet and then 10 feet, 12 feet, it ended up growing to 30 plus feet in some areas. And once you get to that height, a fall from that height is pretty lethal to the human body in comparison with the shorter heights of the wall. And so that kind of violence, I think, is something that Tanya is touching upon in her work and visibilizing that actually in terms that we can grapple with and understand, rather than it being some, a fact or figure that's out there, actually something concrete in front of our faces. And this was, a continuation of her conversation about, how it's her own experience of how she's processing the trauma of the border. Yeah, and John, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this piece from Porfirio, because, this came out of this whole process. And like you and I were saying before we hopped on Zoom, like I think this is new for Porfirio's work and it's exciting direction, but I'd love to hear a little bit about your take on how, Porfirio is processing his own experiences through these pieces in the show.
Yeah, I think this is a really great example of how this research process has changed or helped the practice of these artists grow in ways they didn't even realize. So this is the first video piece that I believe Porfirio has ever made, and he's going to continue to work in this vein. But the tapestry that you see on the left is what you see being woven in the TV monitor. And it was made over the course of 10 hours, which is the duration of time that he migrated from Mexico from 8 p.m. at night to 8 a.m. in the morning. And what he brought with him in his backpack has been cut up and woven into the tapestry. So it was made in real time over 10 hours for this show, especially for this show. And so you have food packaging, you have dollar bills, you have the pants that he was wearing, his clothing that he was wearing, and the backpack as well, all woven into this. And in the text of the video where he's talking, he talks about how trauma is processed historically in his culture, and this was really something that really helped him to process his own trauma, and I think it really was liberating for him, therapeutic, cathartic.
And I feel like too, this piece also came out of conversations with Tanya, like thinking about her performance-based work and like ways that could be incorporated into Porfirio's practice. Yeah, and this whole direction just feels really, really exciting for me to see. I think for all of us to see Porfirio's work going into. And I know we got a question in the question and answer box, and I am going to try and wrap up in the next few minutes so that we do have time to answer those questions. But I wanted to quickly go, John, while you're on that topic, these are some shots of other works in the show. We did Tanya and Porfirio pulled pieces from the Fowler Museum's collection of various 20th century textiles from Oaxaca. We also had contemporary craft artists from Oxnard and Ventura submit work for the show. So Servilleta and Animals from My Village, both from women of different generations living in Oxnard, creating these works who have immigrated from Oaxaca, but kind of to provide another context of this work. Let me see if I can get to it. Yeah, this was the last piece. This is a piece of Porfirio's that's actually over at Museum of Contemporary Art, Santa Barbara. John, I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about this one, and then we will wrap up and go to question and answers.
Well, yeah, I think you can see here how Porfirio is developing as an artist, feeling that freedom to be contemporary, to embrace these issues of modernism that were, influenced by the traditions of his peoples. And so this is the form taken from one of the Greco-friezes. They call them Greco-friezes, but they're indigenous, obviously, from Mitla, and he's transferred it into a 3D sculpture on the floor. He's woven it with cochineal thread, and it's called Absence. So you have that void in the middle, which signifies the absence. And if you could quickly go back, Audrey, like 2 slides, there was that wheel piece that's in the Fowler show. Yeah,
Yes.
I think is also an interesting development for him. So he's created this wheel and woven different shades of cochineal, which can lead us into talk about how those different shades of cochineal get developed. But in the background are photographs from the history of the Ventura area that are hidden and revealed as the wheel slowly turns. So you can see how he's exploring as an artist and really feeling like he's been given the opportunity to have that freedom.
Yeah, and has parallels also in Tanya's work, Somos Mujeres, again, thinking about like visibilizing labor, visibilizing family, and those stories behind it all. So I think as we wrap up, I also just want to give a big, humongous thank you to the Fowler Museum and their team. Without them, this exhibition would not have been possible. And they shaped this exhibition along with our team and Tanya and Porfirio. And so I'm just really thankful to Sylvia, to all the teams, to Amy, for all the work that you all helped us with and, in making this show possible. So I just want to say thank you so much for hosting me and John, for hosting the show. And yeah, we'd love to open up to questions.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for those insights and those beautiful pictures. So our first question is from one of our guests, and they're asking if you could say a little bit more about the substances added to the cochineal to change the pH and attain different colors or different shades.
Sure. Yeah. There's a bunch of things that happen. So you can add things to the cochinilla, but also, I think we're thinking about temperature as of the water, as the yarn is added to the dye stuff, time as well. So amount of time that something is in hot water along with different ingredients. But the basics of it is, whether you add an acid material, something like a citrus fruit, lemon, orange, or you add something basic, those will kind of begin to get you that range of colors. But really, it depends also on those things like time and temperature. John, do you have things to add to that?
I mean, yeah, it's the basic as just as adding lemon juice to change the color. And Freyo often does this experiment in his hands to show that change, but it's also like over dyeing what color the fabric is before you dye it, and as you said, and I think there's other materials that I, as not an expert, I don't remember exactly. I think I missed that workshop.
Vinegar and salt too.
Yeah.
Right? Right. And then we have another question here. An individual would like to know if the insect lives after the dye is collected from it. And here's where the labor and sacrifice come.
Yeah, so the insect is actually, collected from the nopal cactus and then it's actually dried. So it dies in that process of becoming dried, and then it's actually ground to create a powder that's then added to, whatever the dye stuff is, if it's a vat of water or it goes into, makeup or a cosmetic product. But usually it's dried and then ground and then is added. So unfortunately, no, the insect does not live. I wonder if there's a way to make that happen, but yeah, yeah.
And perhaps also on the theme of labor, you could speak a bit about like the amount of cochineal, the amount of cochineal used for a specific amount of dye.
It's a lot.
Lot.
It's a lot. Yeah. So, there's baskets of dried cochinilla within Porfirio's studio. And so thinking about, how those translate to actual dye stuff that's then used. Yeah, a lot of insects, I think, their labor and their materiality of their bodies are needed to create the kind of the amount of material actually needed for those dyes. I can't speak in specifics. John, can you?
On what, sorry?
On the amount of dried cochinilla that's needed to create a certain amount of dye.
Oh, I don't know the specifics, but it's a lot, like she said. It's a lot, a lot, a lot, a lot. And there's a video in the MCA show by Tanya Aguiñiga that shows the whole farming, raising, cultivating process of the cochineal, and it's just fascinating to watch. But it's a lot, very, very labor intensive. But it's been going on for centuries, a decade. I mean, yeah, many, many years. So it's been refined by this epithet. And not all cochineal is the same. It's been cultivated, a certain kind of cochineal has been cultivated. So it's only a specific cochineal that you can use to make these particular dye stuffs.
Mm. I'm interested too in the future of the research and these collaborations and this framework of knowledge sharing. And you mentioned you took a lot of audio and oral histories. What are your hopes for that content?
Yeah, I think for the audio, more than oral histories, it was really dialogue between Tanya and Porfirio and anyone who happened to be in our, bubble as we were traveling around, whether it was Javier, who's Porfirio's nephew, or it's Porfirio's brother-in-law or sister who's also working at the studio, whose home we were, graciously they shared with us. Um, our other artists in LA or the other artists we saw in Oaxaca. I think it's that kind of, day-to-day conversation that is really exciting to me as a researcher and as a curator. So some excerpts from those interviews will go into a publication for the show. And I think kind of beautifully bring together some of these strands that we've been talking about today, some of these more contemporary issues. And I also think that connects to another question that I'm seeing in the Q&A box. I also want to make sure I stop talking and give John room to speak, but I'm seeing this question that says, how has the curatorial experience changed when you collaborate closely with the artists and then the artists among themselves? I just think that, artists lead the way. So I think Tanya and Porfirio in their conversation have taken this show and this work to places that like we could have never gotten to just, purely collaborating with the artists and curators. So I really think that artist to artist exchange was completely transformative and generative for the project in really beautiful ways. Yeah, so that's what I have to say. John, I'm going to pass it off to you to answer any of those questions.
I mean, yeah, from the very beginning, Tanya and Porfirio were a huge part of this project and our guides, really.
Yeah.
And over the course of the research phase and the exhibition phase, we were fortunate enough because originally it was just going to be one exhibition and one location where Tanya and Porfirio were going to be part of a larger group of artists that were exploring the intersection of indigenous knowledge and contemporary art. In fact, we had a different title for the show. It was called Cosmovision Indigena. And the whole dialogue around this project has been fueled by these two artists. And we were lucky enough to be able to pluck Porfirio and Tanya's projects out and make this huge exhibition and this really essential exhibition at the Fowler, with the support of the Getty and the encouragement of the Getty. And now we have a smaller show at the MCA in Santa Barbara that also has their work in it and continues this dialogue with a group of contemporary artists. But yeah, I mean, they've just been a huge part of it, and they've really guided it all along.
And it's very beautiful how you think about residencies, and often we think about it for one artist or one individual. And here it was knowledge sharing between two artists. And also you were bringing in other members of community. So might you say a few words about the importance of bringing in community in these residencies for artists and the impact of that?
John, you wanna go at that?
Well, yeah, I think that was one of the most rewarding parts of the project. Seeing the My Cup youth learn, grow, being able to incorporate into the Fowler show textiles that are contemporary and made by non-professional weavers, and have them contextualized with items from the collection of the Fowler. I think that's huge, and just a very rewarding part of the project.
Yeah,
Audrey?
and Tanya always reminds me, like, the way that she's thinking about weaving and the way that she's thinking about threads either being intertwined or stretched together, or, resisting under pressure or not, being pulled, being stretched, is just a metaphor for the ways that we exist in community and what we need to do to kind of survive together. And whether something's flexible or more rigid, she's constantly reminding me of weaving as a metaphor for community. And I think that, like John said, like that's been one of the most rewarding parts of this project is, those moments when we were in community.
Mm-hmm. And that was built upon, Tanya just finished another residency with the Fowler,
Right.
just called Art and Making in Nature at the UCLA Lab School. And it was this wonderful experience where the classrooms got to dye and then weave together. And it was during the week of the election as well. And so there was a lot of student shares about sort of
Mm.
that practice of coming together as a community and weaving.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so that was a wonderful experience. So with that, I want to thank you both for this wonderful talk today and sharing the background of the project and the wonderful images. And so we're going to end here. And I look forward to future conversations. And to everyone who has joined us today, please look at what's upcoming in Fowler Public programs and join us again, either virtually or in person. So thank you very much. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you, John.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Take care.
Bye-bye.